So today we're talking to Kent Nicholson, who is the director of musical theater at Playwrights Horizons in New York. And we're going to talk to him about what that means. Kent, I think when people think of Playwrights Horizons, they often think about plays and not about musicals. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you do at Playwrights Horizons to bring musicals into their world?
Sure. I think Playwrights actually has a long legacy of doing musicals too. So I think you're correct. I think people mostly think of plays. We also have the word playwright in our name, so that makes a lot of sense. But if you look at our history, among other things, we did the world premieres of Sunday in the Park with George, Once on This Island, Assassins, Violet, Floyd and Clea, Spitfire Grill, Grey Gardens. So there's a long legacy of pieces that have come through Playwrights. In fact, Playwrights was one of the first not-for-profit organizations to have somebody on staff dedicated solely to musical theater. And the words composer and librettist and lyricist are actually in our mission statement. And we're one of the few organizations who does that as well, considers composers and lyricists playwrights. So that's why I have a job. And my job mostly, we try to do a musical a year, although with the way funding works these days and finances work these days, we don't always succeed in that. But my job is to make sure that we are commissioning writers, that we're properly developing those commissions, to keep an eye on who's writing and bring writers in to our fold as seems appropriate, to identify writers who might write a musical that fits our aesthetic, and to develop their work and to develop relationships with them and to manage the mission process we have. We're one of the few organizations that allows for unsolicited submissions. So anybody who's written a musical around the country and wants to submit it to Playwrights Horizons, it will get read and responded to. That's one of the things we do as part of our mission, which is playwright-centered.
That's pretty amazing because that's rare to find these days. It's really tough to find a place that has, and it's not that people don't want to accept the submissions, it's just that they don't have the resources to read everything that comes in the door, why they shut that down usually.
Yeah, I mean, we, and on some levels that's appropriate. I mean, we, not every theater is devoted to new works in the way that we are. Because we have playwrights and composers and lyricists in our mission statement, we feel that's a service to the community to make sure that people can have their stuff read at our level. So that's very much at the heart of what we do. Other theaters are more looking for things that might fit their aesthetic. And so to read everything, whether it fits their aesthetic or not, can be a tremendous waste of time and resources. And frankly, not just for the theater, but also for the writers who are sending their work in to a theater where, not for a lack of quality, but for a lack of aesthetic lineup, would not get done. And so that's another thing that I always try and urge. While we're happy to read anything, I would urge writers in general to be very careful about who they submit to make sure that aesthetically what they're writing matches aesthetically what the theater produces.
Right, so they have to do their homework and check out the theater, check out their website, take a look at the kinds of works they've been producing, get an idea of what that theater's aesthetic is before they submit their work.
Yeah, and it's a little bit more time up front, but I think it saves a lot of time and frustration. And frankly, if you're submitting hard copies, money on the back end of it. And you're just narrowing your search to the likely theaters. So you're also increasing your chances of getting stuff done if you're actually limiting, oddly, where you're sending stuff.
Yes, being more selective. So tell me, there's sort of a couple different pathways. A writer can either submit to you unsolicited, or you're always actively looking for writers. So let's examine both of those pathways. If I were a writer who are part of a team that had written a musical and just submitted it to you cold, what's the potential pathway that would happen after that?
Well, it takes a long time. You know, I mean, like anybody else, we tend to produce people who we have relationships with. What the sending in cold submission process allows for is the opportunity for me to get to know you and to get to know your work. If you send something in to me and I respond positively to it, either even if it's something that we wouldn't potentially do, you know, part of my job is to know who's writing quality work. And so the likelihood of me being able to steer you in another direction, or to remember your name so that the next time you submit, if again something sort of pops in your piece for me, to reach out and say something to you increases. Now, you know, that takes multiple submissions sometimes, and not everybody, you know, it takes a long time to do a musical in the first place, so that might take a little bit of time. But that is something that can and often does happen. Often in conjunction with, you know, small productions at other theaters that allow me to go see your work, whether that's readings like at your place, or at concerts at like Joe's Pub or 54 Below, or places like that. You know, all of those things sort of add up over time. The more I see your name and the more I respond to the material, the more likely it is that I'll invite you to submit something or start a conversation with you. And from there, that, you know, obviously the other things begin to fall in line as well. You know, again, because part of my job is finding out who's writing, reading things like your guys' newsletter and other organizations like yours, become a large part of what I do as well. Sort of making sure I note who's getting readings and who's doing workshops and who's a member, and who, you know, all of those things are very useful for me.
Cool. And let's say you identify a project that you do think has some potential, or a writing team that has some potential. What would be the next steps at Playwrights Horizons to start to develop either that team or their specific project?
Well, the first thing would be to you know, to get to know them a little bit by attending some of their events, some of their other events at other places, and beginning a conversation with them. Then after that, you know, if at some point you know, you send me a piece that comes across the desk and I think, well, this is, you know, this is the one that I need to get in front of my boss, Tim Sanford, who's the artistic director, then I would try and schedule a 29-hour reading of it. And the goal of that 29-hour reading initially would be less about us producing, although that's always a possibility, and more about giving the piece exposure and a leg up, and getting other people to see it as well. Obviously, when we do a reading, people pay attention, and so I try and get as many producers in the room as possible, in case we decide not to do it, which is more likely the case than not, but that then other people can take the ball and run with it, and simply to give the writer the opportunity. But what it does functionally is get the writer in the room, get the writer in the building, getting them talking with our staff a little bit, getting our community to know them, which just makes it more likely down the line that either we'll commission something or that we'll produce something else. So it's a step-by-step process. It takes time, but when you only do one a year, and we also have 4 or 5 commissions out at any given time, and our first priority is often to those.
So you're saying you generally only do one of those 29-hour readings a year, or do you do more, but sometimes for the commissioned?
It varies. I meant producing one a year, but yeah, but how many of the 29-hour readings we do varies depending on what state our commissions are in. Mm-hmm. So when we commission a project, that is guaranteed a reading at some point. And with musicals, we tend not to give up after one reading. So that usually guarantees multiple readings, although the contract only specifies one. And those take priority in terms of our resources, because those are the pieces that we've made a financial commitment to already. And so depending, we do maybe 4 or 5 29-hour readings of musicals a year. By contrast, we do 20 new play readings a year, so that gives you a sense of the numbers.
Well, and that's certainly about resources too, isn't it?
It's about resources, it's about time, it's about space, it's about money, it's about how many people have to be involved as opposed to a play. I mean, those 20, some of them are the actors show up a half an hour before the reading and they read it cold. So that doesn't happen with a musical, obviously. So that's part of it. But if we have 3 commissions that get turned in, or where the writers are at a point where they need a second or third reading, then those resources go towards that first in a given year, and then I try to make sure that there's at least one writer whose work we haven't seen as part of that mix every year.
To get to know
exactly, to get to know some new people. And so there's 1 or 2 spots usually a year for a 29-hour reading, depending on the year. So that's not a lot. So that's why it's a long process of getting to know people, because when you just put the numbers together, we receive about 150 submissions a year. So when you start to just put the numbers together, that's the odds aren't great, but it happens. So there you go.
Talking about just musicals, obviously the plays category.
Yeah, and the plays, just for comparison for people who might be interested, we receive over 1,000 new play submissions a year, and we do about 20 readings. So the numbers are actually worse in the long run for the plays. So.
That's true. So I guess the odds wind up evening out a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the commissioning process? What is it that when you commission a team, are you looking, are you prescriptive about the, are you looking for a particular show, a particular theme? Are you just interested in a team and what they can do, or does that vary?
We're never prescriptive. We never say, we want you to write this show. We always have a conversation with them about what they want to write. We're more interested in the team or the artists that are involved. And we have, however, had artists come to us and say, would you be interested in commissioning this musical about X? And we say no, because it doesn't sound like a Playwrights Horizons musical. We've had artists who say, would you want to do this show? And we say, no, not that one. What else do you got? And they say something else, and we say, yeah, we'll do that one. So we do tend to have, with musicals, some sense of what people are writing when we commission them. And we do put some control over that in terms of, not just saying, here, go write, making sure that the idea sort of lines up with our interests, but we don't dictate that at all. And then there are writers who we've commissioned who we then wait a while before they come up with the idea that we're all in agreement on. And that's fine too. It's a long process, so we're sort of eager to make sure it fits for everybody.
So it's a balancing act between the show the writer wants to write, but in order for you to invest your commission resources, it needs to be something you would potentially produce.
Yeah, I mean, the goal for us is ultimately production. And I can't tell you the specific statistics, but we produce far more of our completed commissions than not. I'm trying to think. I mean, there are commissions that where the projects have simply fallen apart and never gotten finished for various reasons. There are commissions that, even though we put a 4-year window on them, that are 8 years old now, that I can think of, where the writers are starting to write it this summer, and they've had the commission now for 8 years. So we're pretty patient about it.
You only generally one slot a year to do the show, so you can't. There's no reason to be impatient, right?
Right, that's exactly right. But and we have had years where where nothing that we're working on and nothing that we've done sort of piques our interest enough to commit the resources to producing it, or we feel like are ready. But at the same time, we've had years where 3 shows are ready at the same time. And so then we have to sort of figure out the calendar to make sure that they can all fall in line and get done in an appropriate fashion. So that's also part of my job, is to sort of make sure things are sort of coming through in a organized enough fashion that nothing butts up against, and we end up having to let a piece go because we simply can't produce it. But that anything that we commission can be considered for production.
And if you find yourself in a year where there isn't anything that is ready and you're interested in producing, would you just not produce a musical that year?
Yeah, next year, for example, we're not doing a musical, in part because the piece that's probably closest to being ready is going to get an out-of-town show first. So, which we often also do, is partner with regional theaters, excuse me, to do the shows before they come into New York, so that they don't have to open cold in New York, which can always be a little dicey. So that show's going to get done in the spring, and probably then we'll produce it in the following year. So just by the way things happened, and then the other commissions are not quite yet in a state, and there wasn't anything that Tim felt comfortable moving forward at this point in time. Which isn't to say that there aren't other things sitting on my desk that, but we're also keeping an eye on, so that we have things to do in the future. We're pretty committed to never going more than 1 year without doing one. So, yeah.
And then the other arena is that that if someone sends something unsolicited that you see a lot of promise in but isn't right for Playwrights Horizons, or a commission starts to turn into something that isn't right for you anymore, what kind of avenues do you have to try and find other homes for that work?
Well, the chair I sit in is a pretty connected one. So, for me, it's about sending it out into the world to my colleagues who do what I do in other theaters, whether that be in New York or regionally, and trying to advocate for the piece in a way of getting it read and responded to in a way that maybe writers can't always. And trying to help them find, an appropriate home for the piece. That's really the best I can do. Through the National Alliance for Musical Theater, there are other ways for me to advocate for things in terms of speaking on panels, doing things like this, or helping writers understand what the process is behind the scenes a little bit, but specifically sort of sending the piece around to people who I think might actually be interested in producing it, where I think it has a real shot. And doing some of that work for the writers is about the best I can do at that point.
Oh, that's a lot. That's a lot, and it's a real gift to the writers. Kent, we've been asking at all of our interviewees a particular question that is in the fantasy realm. If you were to wake up tomorrow morning and suddenly someone just gifted Playwrights Horizons $100 million specifically for the development of new musicals, how would you want to spend that money?
I think about this far more often than I should. I would spend that money on production, actually, but not just productions of anything, but productions of musicals that really are attempting to risk inside the form. I think there's a world of musical out there that, either formally or through what kind of music it chooses to use, or the kind of movement that requires to make it work, never get done because they don't necessarily fit what we think of as a musical when we say a musical. It's not a musical comedy. It's not commercial in any known sense of the word, but deserves production. And I think those musicals often fall by the wayside because people are a little too afraid of them. So if I had $100 million to spend, I would make sure that musicals like that got a home. I think a lot of the musicals that we do that to a certain degree, but the number of pieces that I see that deserve to be done and people are just a little too afraid of them is depressing. And so I would stop that depression by producing them if I could.
There you go. That would be fantastic. To wrap up, Kent, I'd love to ask you, this dovetails into that a little bit. This is a two-part question. What do you see as the future of musical theater? And what advice would you give to writers who are trying to write the musicals of tomorrow?
Those are good questions. For me, the future of musical theater has to do with how music is used as a form inside storytelling, which I think is being blown open right now by a lot of musical theater writers, whether they realize it or not. And there are accidental musical theater writers, and there are musical theater writers who are purposely writing musicals like this. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of playwrights I know now who use music very intentionally and use songs very intentionally, but don't realize that they're writing musicals. And I say to them, this is a musical. And they don't like to think of it that way because for them, musicals are an old-fashioned commercial form, right? So making people understand that the world of musical theater is a much bigger canvas than people usually ascribe it to it. And I think that's going to break open in a lot of ways. I see that happening with younger writers now who are less concerned about formality and just want to write and experiment and play. And a lot of them are very good musicians who are writing songs inside their pieces that are quite good. The intentional ones are doing the same thing, but obviously they know they're writing musicals. They're very specifically looking at what the form is and what it can do. Dave Malloy is a good example of that with The Great Comet, and finding ways of creating immersive experiences in it, or using music that we don't traditionally hear, or how they think about writing music as a form of dramaturgy. And that's a very different way of writing than writing songs. So I think that's going to become more and more the norm. I don't think the old-fashioned musical will ever entirely go away and may commercially still dominate, but I do think theaters are more willing to engage in that kind of risk-taking in terms of how music operates than they may have been a while ago. So,
well, that's an exciting future. And what can you give? Would you give some advice to those writers about that are either exploring those forms or maybe haven't thought about exploring those forms yet or don't know how?
Yeah, I would simply say get your work done, any way you can, even if that means self-producing. I can think of a few writers, Cesar Alvarez, for example, who is doing this in great ways and has managed to have some theaters that don't traditionally do musicals like Soho Rep take on his musical. He's used a position at University of the Arts to develop his stuff and other people's stuff with students. I think those experiences have informed those students' experiences about what a musical can be, which then carries out into the world. So that's another way to think about doing it. But really make sure that your work is getting done and up there and proving that this form that you're experimenting with or that you're playing with is viable, that it can work, that audiences will respond to it. And I think once you do that, then the industry will follow suit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ken. You guys are doing amazing work out there, and we will watch for what is coming next. And
Great, thank you.
Spending some time with us today. Thank you so much for that.
Happy to do it.